Smile for the cameras, Naomi. That's what people like you are here for. The words were barely out of Evelyn Whitmore's mouth when the ballroom lights flared brighter against the crystal chandeliers overhead, turning the entire Grand Monarch Hotel into a sea of gold and glass. 100 conversations softened into whispers beneath the slow violin melody drifting across the gala floor. Naomi Carter stood motionless near the center of the room, one hand still resting against the untouched champagne flute a waiter had offered her moments earlier. The sting on her cheek wasn't what froze the air around her. It was the silence after. The kind of silence only rich people knew how to create. Heavy, controlled, dangerous. Camera flashes flickered from the far side of the ballroom, where financial reporters had gathered around the Whitmore family's billion-dollar merger announcement. Every lens was pointed toward Naomi now, toward the black woman in the white satin gown standing beneath a chandelier worth more than the apartment she grew up in on the south side of Chicago. A thin red line near the corner of her lip caught the light for half a second before she calmly wiped it away with the back of her hand. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The musicians stopped playing without realizing they had stopped. Even the servers carrying silver trays of lobster crostini and bourbon glasses stood frozen beside marble pillars wrapped in white orchids. Evelyn Whitmore adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist as if nothing unusual had happened. Her face remained cold, elegant, untouched by remorse. "You embarrassed this family in front of our investors," she said quietly, though every person in the ballroom could hear her. "You should have remembered who invited you here." Naomi slowly lifted her eyes to meet hers. Calm eyes. Steady eyes. The kind built from years of hearing people underestimate her before they realized too late who she really was. Across the ballroom, Richard Whitmore stood near the massive LED screen displaying Whitmore Capital Global Expansion in silver letters nearly 20 feet high. He looked less angry than irritated, like a man watching a meeting run over time. Beside him, senators, hedge fund executives, and Middle Eastern investors exchanged uneasy glances over crystal glasses filled with 12-year bourbon. None of them stepped in. Not one. Naomi could hear the faint hum of Manhattan traffic 30 floors below the ballroom windows. Rain streaked softly against the glass overlooking Park Avenue, while the city glowed silver beneath the storm clouds. Somewhere behind her, someone whispered, "I told you she'd get too comfortable." Another voice answered with a low chuckle. A billion-dollar deal, and she still forgot her place. Naomi inhaled once through her nose. Slow. Controlled. Her mother used to tell her that dignity sounded like silence when the world expected you to scream. She remembered that now. She remembered tiny details too. The smell of engine grease from her mother's city bus uniform. The cracked radiator in their apartment that hissed all winter long. Nights spent coding logistics software on a second-hand laptop balanced on her knees while sirens echoed outside their building at 2 a.m. Nobody in this ballroom knew about those nights. To them, Naomi Carter was just the polished black CEO, standing beside Whitmore Capital for diversity headlines and magazine covers. A modern success story wrapped in designer fabric. Useful, presentable, replaceable. But hidden beneath the ballroom floor, inside freight hubs from Los Angeles to Dubai, inside shipping ports and airline cargo systems across 4 continents, Naomi's infrastructure was already moving billions of dollars every single day. And only she knew how fragile Whitmore's empire really was without it. Daniel Whitmore noticed something then. While everyone else stared at Naomi waiting for anger, tears, or humiliation, she wasn't looking at Evelyn anymore. She was looking at the contract resting near the stage beside the ceremonial gold signing pen. And for the first time all night, Daniel felt cold. Daniel Whitmore could not stop staring at Naomi Carter. Not because of the mark fading slowly against her cheek, and not because every billionaire, investor, and politician in the ballroom was pretending not to look directly at her. It was because she looked completely unafraid. The realization unsettled him more than the silence in the room. Naomi lowered her hand from her face and adjusted the sleeve of her white gown with quiet precision. The fabric shimmered softly beneath the chandelier light, like fresh snow under moonlight. Somewhere near the back wall, a waiter accidentally dropped a fork onto a silver tray. The sharp metallic sound snapped several guests back to life. Conversations restarted in fragments. Nervous laughter drifted between tables covered in white roses and candles. But the atmosphere had changed. Daniel felt it immediately. Wealthy people were experts at pretending uncomfortable things had never happened, but tension still moved through the ballroom like invisible smoke. Richard Whitmore stepped toward the stage with controlled irritation tightening his jaw. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced smoothly, forcing confidence into his voice, "let us continue with tonight's partnership celebration." Applause followed, thin and uncertain. Naomi did not clap. She stood beside the long black marble table where the merger contract rested beneath the spotlight. $1 billion. That was what every network anchor had been calling it all week. The deal that would modernize Whitmore Capital for the next generation. The deal that would stabilize their shipping losses overseas. The deal that Wall Street believed would save the company from another brutal quarter. Daniel knew the truth was uglier than the headlines. 3 months earlier, Whitmore Capital had quietly lost nearly $400 million after a disastrous expansion failure in Singapore. Their freight prediction systems had collapsed during a supply chain crisis, costing clients millions every hour. Investors panicked. Board members threatened resignations. That was when Richard Whitmore found Naomi Carter. Or rather, found her technology. Daniel still remembered the first presentation Naomi gave inside the executive conference tower downtown. No theatrics. No arrogance. Just numbers moving across giant LED screens while she calmly explained how her adaptive logistics network predicted disruptions 48 hours before they happened. Within 20 minutes, half the executives in the room looked terrified. The other half looked greedy. Richard Whitmore only smiled once during the entire presentation. Daniel recognized that smile. It was the smile his father wore whenever he saw something valuable he intended to control. Naomi reached for the champagne flute in front of her now, then stopped herself before taking a sip. Her reflection trembled faintly in the golden liquid. Across the ballroom, Evelyn Whitmore leaned close to a socialite wearing emerald jewelry worth more than most suburban homes. "She is being dramatic," Evelyn whispered, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. People from her background always confuse professionalism with emotion. A few people nodded politely. Others looked uncomfortable. Daniel glanced toward Naomi again, expecting anger this time. Instead, she looked tired. Not weak. Not defeated. Just tired in the way people looked when they realized they had entered a room hoping to be respected and discovered they had only been tolerated. Outside the massive ballroom windows, rain streaked harder against the Manhattan skyline. Traffic lights blurred red and white below through the storm. Naomi finally looked toward the contract again. Daniel followed her gaze. The gold signing pen rested perfectly beside the final page. Elegant. Expensive. Dangerous. Then he noticed something else. Naomi was not looking at the signature line. She was looking at page 87. And suddenly Daniel remembered the argument he overheard 2 nights earlier between Richard Whitmore and the corporate attorneys behind closed doors. "Once she signs," Richard had said quietly, "the algorithm becomes ours permanently." A cold weight settled into Daniel's chest. For the first time that night, he began to understand why Naomi Carter had refused to pick up the pen. Naomi Carter slowly turned another page of the contract while the ballroom tried desperately to recover its rhythm. Violin music resumed near the stage, softer this time, uncertain, like the musicians themselves no longer trusted the room. Candlelight flickered across polished marble floors while servers moved carefully. Between tables carrying plates of filet mignon and truffle risotto worth more than the weekly grocery bill Naomi's mother used to stretch across 14 days. The smell of expensive perfume mixed with aged whiskey and rain drifting faintly through the revolving entrance doors downstairs. Everything about the gala was designed to communicate power. Old power. White power. The kind built through generations of private schools, political favors, inherited board seats, and family names engraved on hospitals and museum wings across Manhattan. Naomi understood that world long before she entered it. She had studied it the same way she studied broken systems and unstable code. Quietly, patiently. When she was 16 years old, she used to sit beside the radiator in their apartment with headphones on, teaching herself predictive algorithms from free online lectures while her mother slept after double shifts driving the number 22 bus route through freezing Chicago winters. Their building smelled like rust, old cooking oil, and wet concrete after snowstorms. Sometimes the heat failed for days. Sometimes the lights flickered during storms. Naomi learned early that survival depended on solving problems before they collapsed around you. By 28, she had built Carter systems from a cramped warehouse office near the South Loop using borrowed computers and second-hand servers that overheated every summer afternoon. Investors laughed at her during early meetings. Some assumed she was the assistant carrying presentation files. One venture capitalist asked if she had a technical co-founder somewhere in the background. Naomi never argued. She simply kept building, and eventually her systems became impossible to ignore. Cargo delays dropped by 30% wherever her software operated. Airline freight companies started calling her directly. International ports signed multi-million-dollar contracts after seeing her prediction accuracy during hurricane season. Within 6 years, half the global shipping industry quietly depended on Naomi Carter's infrastructure, whether they realized it or not. But inside rooms like this ballroom, surrounded by white tuxedos, diamonds, and old money laughter, many people still saw only a black woman who had somehow wandered too close to power. Richard Whitmore approached the marble signing table with the confidence of a man accustomed to controlling outcomes before conversations even began. His silver cufflinks caught the chandelier light as he adjusted his jacket. "We are wasting time," he said calmly, though tension sharpened every syllable. "The investors are waiting." Naomi looked up from the contract. Page 87 transfers permanent ownership rights of my adaptive infrastructure after merger execution, she said evenly. Nearby conversation stopped again almost immediately. Richard smiled without warmth. "Standard integration language." "No," Naomi replied softly. "It is disguised acquisition language." A murmur moved through the ballroom. Daniel Whitmore felt his stomach tighten as several attorneys near the stage suddenly avoided eye contact. Naomi tapped one perfectly manicured finger against the page. "Your revisions were added 48 hours ago." Richard's expression darkened for the first time that evening. "Be careful what accusations you make in public." Naomi held his gaze. Calm. Controlled. "Be careful what contracts you expect people to sign without reading." Across the room, Evelyn Whitmore exhaled sharply in annoyance before stepping closer, the diamonds around her neck shimmering beneath the chandeliers like shards of ice. "This is exactly why partnerships like this become difficult," she said coldly. "Emotion clouds judgment." Naomi turned toward her slowly. "No," she answered. "Greed does." The ballroom fell silent again. Even the rain against the windows seemed louder now. Daniel looked around the room and realized something unsettling. Naomi Carter was the only person standing there who did not look afraid of losing anything. Richard Whitmore's smile disappeared slowly, like a curtain being pulled across a stage. The warmth he performed for investors and cameras only moments earlier drained from his face beneath the chandelier light. Around him, executives shifted uncomfortably in tailored tuxedos while assistants holding tablets suddenly became very interested in avoiding eye contact. Naomi Carter remained still beside the marble signing table, one hand resting lightly against the thick contract pages while rain crawled down the ballroom windows behind her in silver streaks. Somewhere near the orchestra platform, a violinist lowered his bow entirely. The room had become too tense for music. "You are misunderstanding legal terminology," Richard said finally, each word clipped with controlled irritation. Naomi did not raise her voice. "No," she replied calmly. "I understand it perfectly." A few investors exchanged glances. One of the attorneys near the stage quietly loosened his tie. Naomi lifted the contract slightly, the paper edges catching the gold ballroom lighting. Section 14 grants Whitmore Capital indefinite ownership rights over every future adaptation of my logistics infrastructure, she continued. Not partnership access. Ownership. Daniel Whitmore saw the exact moment panic flickered through several board members near the front tables. Tiny reactions. Tightened jaws. Fingers tapping crystal glasses. One man whispered something sharply into his phone before stepping toward the edge of the ballroom. Naomi noticed all of it. She always noticed details. That was how she built Carter systems in the first place. Patterns. Reactions. Weak points hidden beneath polished surfaces. Evelyn Whitmore folded her arms tightly across her silver evening gown. "This is becoming embarrassing," she said coldly. "You are standing in the middle of our gala, turning a business celebration into a personal performance." Naomi looked at her for a long second before answering. Your attorneys altered terms after verbal agreements were finalized. That is called negotiation, Evelyn snapped. That is called deception, Naomi answered softly. The silence afterward felt heavier than before. Even the staff standing along the ballroom walls seemed frozen beneath the enormous floral arrangements and golden ceiling lights. Richard stepped closer now, lowering his voice enough to sound calm, while making sure everyone could still hear him. You need to think carefully before walking away from this opportunity. Naomi met his eyes without hesitation. Opportunity, she repeated quietly. Richard gestured toward the ballroom around them. You are standing in a room filled with the most influential people in global finance. Naomi glanced slowly across the gala. Politicians laughing too loudly. Billionaires pretending not to stare. Investors clutching bourbon glasses beside tables covered in imported white roses. Then she looked back at him. Exactly, she said. And somehow your company still needed mine. Daniel felt something shift in the room at those words. Not just tension, fear. Because for the first time that night, people were beginning to understand this was not some ambitious startup founder begging for acceptance from old money elites. Naomi Carter had leverage. Real leverage. One of the Middle Eastern investors near the stage leaned toward his translator and whispered urgently while checking messages on his phone. Another executive from Singapore quietly asked an assistant whether Whitmore's servers were already integrated with Carter Systems architecture. Richard noticed the reactions too. His composure tightened visibly. This merger was supposed to be beneficial for everyone involved, he said. Naomi nodded once. Then why hide the revisions? Richard did not answer immediately. That alone was answer enough. Evelyn stepped forward again, diamonds glittering coldly at her throat. People like you always think success makes you untouchable, she said sharply. But let me make something very clear. You are sitting in this room because we opened the door for you. Naomi stared at her quietly. Rain hammered harder against the glass now, the Manhattan skyline flickering silver beyond the storm. Then Naomi slowly closed the contract and placed it back onto the marble table with careful precision. The soft sound echoed louder than anyone expected. No, she said calmly. You invited me because your company cannot survive the next quarter without my system. And this time, nobody in the ballroom laughed. The air inside the ballroom changed after Naomi Carter spoke those words. It was subtle at first, a shift in posture, a nervous glance between executives, the quiet vibration of phones lighting up beneath white tablecloths. Rain slammed harder against the towering glass windows overlooking Park Avenue, while thunder rolled faintly somewhere above Manhattan. Richard Whitmore stood perfectly still beside the marble signing table, but Daniel knew his father well enough to recognize danger hiding beneath silence. Richard only became quiet when control started slipping away. Naomi reached for the black velvet folder containing the merger contract and slid it gently across the table toward him. The movement was calm, respectful even. That somehow made it worse. You are making a mistake, Richard said finally. His voice carried across the ballroom with the same polished authority that had intimidated politicians and boardrooms for 30 years. Naomi looked at him steadily. No, she answered. I am refusing one. A low murmur spread through the gala crowd. Investors leaned closer together. Reporters near the back entrance began whispering into phones. Daniel noticed 3 different assistants rushing toward the private hallway leading to the executive offices upstairs. Damage control had already started. Evelyn Whitmore's expression hardened beneath the chandelier glow. Do not pretend this is about ethics, she said sharply. You walked into this room wanting validation from people above your station. Several guests froze at the words. Even in rooms like this, some lines sounded uglier when spoken aloud. Naomi did not react immediately. She simply studied Evelyn for a moment while soft jazz music drifted awkwardly from the orchestra platform. Then she asked quietly, above my station? Evelyn stepped closer, her silver heels clicking against the marble floor like tiny hammer strikes. You built software, she said coldly. That does not make you one of us. Daniel felt his stomach drop. Nearby executives suddenly found intense interest in their whiskey glasses. Nobody interrupted. Nobody defended Naomi. The silence of wealthy people protecting their own settled over the room again. Naomi inhaled slowly. The faint mark near her cheek had faded into a pale shadow beneath the ballroom lights, but Daniel could still see it. So could everyone else. My mother drove a city bus for 26 years, Naomi said calmly. Every winter, she woke up at 4:30 in the morning so people in neighborhoods like yours could get to offices like this on time. Evelyn crossed her arms. And now you are standing in a $1 billion negotiation because Richard gave your company legitimacy. Naomi almost smiled then, but there was no humor in it. Only disappointment. No, she said softly. I am standing here because your company failed 3 overseas systems audits in 6 months, and your infrastructure nearly collapsed during the Singapore freight crisis. The room went dead silent again. Daniel saw one board member physically stiffen beside the stage. Naomi continued before anyone could interrupt her. Your shipping prediction failures cost your investors almost $400 million. Richard's jaw tightened sharply. Enough. But Naomi did not stop. And if my adaptive network disconnects from your international freight architecture tonight, your Dubai expansion deal dies before Monday morning. A glass shattered somewhere near the back tables. Nobody turned toward the sound. Every eye remained fixed on Naomi Carter. Rainwater streaked silver behind her through the giant windows, while the Manhattan skyline glowed beneath storm clouds like a city holding its breath. Richard Whitmore took one slow step closer now, lowering his voice into something colder. Be very careful not to overestimate your leverage. Naomi held his gaze without blinking. And you should have been more careful underestimating mine. Daniel noticed it then. Not fear in the room. Realization. The investors were beginning to understand something terrifying. The woman they had dismissed all evening was not trapped inside Whitmore Capital's ballroom. Whitmore Capital was trapped inside her system. For several long seconds, nobody inside the ballroom moved. The storm outside washed silver rain across the glass walls of the Grand Monarch Hotel, while candlelight trembled faintly against polished marble floors. Naomi Carter stood alone beside the signing table beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers that hummed softly overhead. Her white gown caught reflections from the city lights beyond the windows, making her look almost untouchable against the darkened skyline of Manhattan. Richard Whitmore stared at her with the controlled fury of a man unaccustomed to resistance. Around him, executives whispered quietly into phones while legal advisors exchanged pale, nervous glances near the stage. Somewhere in the ballroom kitchen, a tray crashed to the floor. The sound echoed briefly before disappearing beneath the heavy silence. Naomi could feel hundreds of eyes on her, but she no longer looked at the crowd. She looked at the rain sliding slowly down the windows 30 floors above Park Avenue. It reminded her of Chicago winters, of sitting beside fogged apartment glass as buses hissed through slush-covered streets below, of her mother warming frozen hands around cheap coffee before leaving for another double shift. Naomi remembered how exhaustion used to settle into her mother's shoulders like wet concrete. She remembered hearing people talk down to her mother in grocery stores, in banks, in parking garages, as if poverty erased dignity. Her mother never shouted back, never begged for respect. She simply kept moving forward with quiet pride that nobody could take from her. Naomi understood that kind of strength now more than ever. Daniel Whitmore watched her carefully from across the ballroom. The room expected anger from her. Maybe tears. Maybe a dramatic outburst that would allow everyone present to dismiss her as emotional or unstable. Instead, Naomi only looked tired. Tired in a way that seemed older than the ballroom itself. The orchestra musicians sat frozen near the stage, instruments resting silently in their laps. Candle flames flickered across towering arrangements of white orchids, while wealthy strangers pretended not to stare openly at the black woman standing at the center of the most uncomfortable room in Manhattan. Naomi reached up slowly and removed the diamond-shaped VIP badge clipped delicately near her shoulder. The small gold lettering reflected against her fingertips for a moment before she placed it carefully onto the marble table beside the unsigned contract. The soft click against stone sounded louder than the thunder outside. Evelyn Whitmore frowned slightly. "What exactly are you doing?" she asked coldly. Naomi looked at the badge for a second before answering. "Returning access," she said quietly. Richard's expression hardened. "You are letting pride destroy an opportunity most people would spend their entire lives chasing." Naomi turned toward him slowly. "No," she replied. "I am refusing to trade my work for permission to sit quietly while people disrespect me." Nobody interrupted her this time. Not the investors. Not the executives. Not even Evelyn. Naomi's voice remained calm, almost gentle beneath the low rumble of rain beyond the windows. You invited me into this room because your company needed my systems, she continued. But somewhere along the way, you confused access with ownership. Daniel felt the words settle over the ballroom like falling ash. Several board members lowered their eyes. One woman near the stage quietly set down her champagne glass with trembling fingers. Naomi picked up her clutch purse from the edge of the marble table and smoothed one hand across the fabric of her gown. No anger, no performance, only dignity. The mark near her cheek had nearly faded now beneath the soft chandelier light, but the silence surrounding it remained. Richard Whitmore finally stepped forward again. If you walk out tonight, he warned carefully, there will be consequences. Naomi met his eyes one last time. Calm, steady, unafraid. Then she answered in the quietest voice anyone in the ballroom had heard all evening. There already were. And with that, she turned toward the towering ballroom doors while the storm outside continued to swallow Manhattan in silver rain. The ballroom doors closed behind Naomi Carter with a low metallic hush that somehow sounded louder than the orchestra, louder than the rain, louder than the nervous conversations erupting across the gala floor. For one strange moment, nobody inside the Grand Monarch Hotel moved at all. The absence she left behind settled into the room like missing oxygen. Richard Whitmore stared toward the closed doors, jaw rigid beneath the chandelier light, while thunder rolled faintly over Manhattan. Then the first phone buzzed. A young analyst near the back tables glanced down at his screen and immediately went pale. Two more phones lit up beside him. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the quiet ballroom transformed into a storm of vibrating devices, whispered panic, and hurried footsteps across marble floors. Daniel Whitmore pulled his own phone from his jacket pocket just as a flood of notifications exploded across the screen. Carter Systems connection interrupted. Dubai Freight Board requests emergency review. Whitmore Global shares down 9% after leaked gala footage. His stomach tightened. Across the room, one of the senior logistics executives rushed toward Richard holding a tablet with visibly shaking hands. Sir, he whispered urgently. The Singapore routing servers just lost predictive synchronization. Richard snatched the tablet from him. What does that mean? The executive swallowed hard. It means Carter Systems disconnected primary access permissions. Another executive approached almost immediately afterward. The Dubai investors postponed tomorrow morning's signing call. For how long? Richard demanded. The man hesitated. Indefinitely. The room erupted into overlapping voices. Attorneys rushed toward private corners making frantic calls. Investors who had spent the evening smiling beside champagne towers now looked openly alarmed. Several media reporters slipped toward the exits while quietly forwarding the leaked ballroom footage, spreading online faster every second. Daniel opened one of the clips on social media. The video quality was shaky, captured from across the gala floor, but Naomi's calm voice came through perfectly clear. You confused access with ownership. Beneath the clip, millions of views climbed rapidly in real time. Thousands of comments flooded the screen. Some furious, some heartbroken, most defending her. Daniel looked up from his phone slowly. The ballroom no longer resembled a celebration. It looked like a collapsing stock market disguised by candlelight and expensive flowers. Evelyn Whitmore finally stepped toward Richard, her composure cracking for the first time all evening. Fix this, she hissed quietly. Richard ignored her. His eyes remained locked on the numbers flashing red across the tablet screen in his hands. Daniel moved closer and saw the damage himself. Cargo prediction systems offline. International freight delays multiplying by the minute. Automated shipping transfers suspended across 3 ports already integrated with Carter Systems architecture. The realization hit him fully then. Naomi had never threatened them. She had simply walked away. And the empire his family spent decades building had immediately started shaking beneath its own weight. Reconnect the systems. Richard barked toward the executives surrounding him. Now, one of the engineers looked physically ill. We cannot, he admitted quietly. Her adaptive infrastructure requires biometric authorization from Carter Systems headquarters. Richard's face drained of color beneath the ballroom lights. Then call her. Nobody answered immediately, because everyone in the room understood the truth now. Naomi Carter had entered the gala as someone they believed needed Whitmore capital. But the second she walked out those doors, the illusion shattered. The company did not own her technology. They barely understood it. Daniel slowly looked toward the rain-covered windows overlooking Manhattan. Somewhere out there, Naomi Carter was probably sitting quietly in the back of a Blacktown car, while the most powerful people in the city panicked because she finally stopped allowing them to treat her like she was replaceable. And for the first time in his life, Daniel Whitmore felt ashamed of his own last name. Rain washed across the rooftop terrace of the Grand Monarch Hotel in soft silver sheets, while Manhattan glowed beneath the storm like a city submerged underwater. Naomi Carter stood near the edge of the rooftop garden with her arms folded loosely against the cold wind, watching streams of headlights crawl through Park Avenue nearly 30 floors below. The night air smelled like wet concrete, cigarette smoke drifting from neighboring rooftops, and the faint perfume still clinging to her gown from the ballroom downstairs. Behind her, the heavy rooftop door opened with a metallic click. She did not turn around immediately. She already knew who it was. Richard Whitmore stepped onto the terrace alone, without assistants, attorneys, or cameras for the first time that evening. Rain darkened the shoulders of his tailored coat almost instantly. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The sounds of distant traffic and falling rain filled the silence between them. Richard looked older out here beneath the storm. Smaller somehow. The polished confidence he carried inside boardrooms seemed to dissolve beneath the gray New York sky. Naomi kept her eyes on the city. "Your engineers reconnected the secondary routing channels," she said quietly. Richard blinked in surprise. "How did you know that?" Naomi almost smiled. "Because your Singapore freight delays slowed 12 minutes ago." Richard stared at her for a moment before lowering his eyes briefly toward the rooftop floor. "You could have destroyed us tonight," he admitted. Naomi finally turned toward him then. Rain shimmered softly against her white gown, while city lights reflected in her dark eyes. "No," she answered calmly. "Your company was already destroying itself." Richard looked away first. Somewhere below them, a siren echoed through Manhattan traffic before fading into the storm. "I built Whitmore Capital over 32 years, he said quietly. "Do you know what it takes to keep something that large alive?" Naomi studied him carefully. "Not by stealing from people smaller than you." The words landed harder than shouting ever could have. Richard exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders finally cracking beneath exhaustion. "You think I do not know what people in rooms like that are capable of?" he asked bitterly. "I learned long ago that if you do not take control first, someone else takes it from you." Naomi's expression softened slightly, though not with sympathy, more with understanding. "That may explain you," she said, "but it does not excuse you." Rainwater slid slowly down the rooftop glass walls behind them. Richard looked at her cheek for a brief second, guilt flickering visibly across his face before disappearing again. Evelyn should not have done that, he admitted quietly. Naomi held his gaze. Nobody stopped her. The silence after that felt enormous. Richard looked out across the skyline as though searching for words he had never practiced saying before. "You were right," he said finally. "We needed your systems more than we admitted." Naomi said nothing. "And I treated you like an accessory to our survival instead of the reason for it." His voice had lost all sharpness now. Only fatigue remained. Down below, thunder rolled softly beyond the Hudson River while rain streaked across the glowing windows of nearby skyscrapers. Naomi stepped closer to the rooftop railing, watching reflections ripple across black streets far beneath them. "Do you know what disappointed me most tonight?" she asked quietly. Richard looked at her carefully. "Not the contract." Naomi folded her arms tighter against the wind. "Not even the humiliation." She paused briefly. It was watching an entire room full of educated, powerful people decide silence was more comfortable than respect. Richard lowered his eyes again. For the first time in decades, he looked like a man truly ashamed of himself. Naomi reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. A few quick movements across the screen later, she locked it again. "Your secondary routing systems will stabilize within the hour," she said calmly. Richard stared at her in disbelief. "After everything tonight, you are still helping us?" Naomi looked out over Manhattan once more. "I am helping the employees who would suffer for your mistakes," she answered softly. "There is a difference." And standing there beneath the rain and city lights, Richard Whitmore finally understood why Naomi Carter walked into the ballroom with dignity no amount of money could buy. By sunrise, Manhattan looked washed clean. Rainwater still clung to the sidewalks and glass towers of Midtown, while early morning traffic rolled slowly beneath pale, silver light. Inside the back seat of a black town car moving quietly down Lexington Avenue, Naomi Carter rested her head lightly against the window and watched the city wake up around her. Steam curled upward from subway grates. Delivery trucks rattled through narrow streets. Coffee shop lights flickered on one by one against the gray dawn. The mark near her cheek had faded into almost nothing now, hidden beneath soft morning light, and exhaustion resting gently beneath her eyes. Her phone vibrated again across the leather seat beside her. Another news alert. Another financial update. Another headline repeating variations of the same story. Whitmore Capital stocks fall after failed Gala merger. Carter Systems shares surge overnight. Leaked video sparks national debate on corporate racial bias. Naomi silenced the phone without opening the articles. She was too tired for headlines. Too tired for outrage disguised as public sympathy. Outside the car window, two sanitation workers in neon jackets laughed beside a parked garbage truck while cold morning wine swept paper cups along the curb. Naomi watched them quietly and thought about her mother again. About all the mornings she climbed onto freezing bus seats before sunrise, while wealthy strangers barely looked at her when she said good morning. Respect had always been treated like a luxury in America, something handed out selectively depending on neighborhoods, accents, skin color, or last names. Naomi learned that lesson young. But she also learned something else. Dignity did not require permission. The town car slowed near a traffic light as massive digital billboards flickered awake above Times Square. Naomi barely noticed at first until her driver glanced into the rearview mirror with surprise. "Miss Carter," he said softly, "you might want to see this." Naomi looked up through the rain-speckled glass just as the largest NASDAQ billboard shifted screens. For 3 full stories above the street, glowing silver letters appeared against a black background. Carter Systems up 47%. Beneath it, another line faded slowly into view. The future does not ask for permission. Naomi stared at the screen silently, while people on the sidewalks below slowed to take pictures with their phones. Taxis rolled through puddles reflecting silver light across the street. Somewhere nearby, a saxophone player performed beneath an awning for early commuters rushing through the cold. Naomi leaned back quietly into the leather seat. No smile. No celebration. Just stillness. Her phone buzzed once more. This time it was a message from Daniel Whitmore. "I am sorry for what happened." Naomi read the words for several seconds before locking the screen again. Outside the window, Manhattan continued moving as though the world had not shifted overnight. But Naomi knew better. Somewhere inside Whitmore Capital, executives were scrambling through emergency meetings while investors demanded explanations. Somewhere inside luxury apartments and corporate offices, people who ignored her yesterday were suddenly speaking her name with caution today. But none of that mattered as much as the simple peace settling quietly into her chest now. The town car stopped briefly beside a crosswalk where a little black girl stood holding her mother's hand beneath a bright yellow umbrella. The little girl looked up at the enormous Carter Systems billboard towering over Times Square and smiled with wide, amazed eyes before tugging excitedly at her mother's sleeve. Naomi watched the child point toward the screen again and again while morning sunlight slowly broke through the clouds above Manhattan. Something inside Naomi softened then. Not pride. Something gentler than that. Hope maybe. The traffic light changed. The town car pulled forward through the city while silver sunlight spilled across wet streets and glass towers. Naomi looked out the window one last time as the billboard disappeared behind them in the distance. Then she closed her eyes quietly and let the silence speak for itself.